Greetings and welcome to SCAR Speaks, a weekly podcast program brought to you by George Mason University School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. My name is de-Graft Johnson. I'm here with Nick Cunningham from the School of Public Policy of GMU, who is here to speak to us about the implications of the recent elections that just happened in Russia. So, Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, for my first question, what would Vladimir Putin's re-election mean for Russia as a country, the region, and then for the entire world? What should we be expecting?
Well, first let's start off with the basics. So the Russian constitution states that no individual can serve as president for more than 2 terms consecutively. So President Putin originally served from late 1999 to 2008, so that's his 2 terms. But as I said, it only happens, you're only restricted from running for 2 terms consecutively. So what you can do, and what Putin actually did, was step aside for a term, put in his protege, current president Dmitry Medvedev, and then after someone else has served a term for a year, you're completely eligible to serve for another 2 terms. Now, another interesting thing on top of that is that while Putin was out and while Medvedev was keeping the seat warm for him, they made some constitutional changes to where the presidential election term used to be 4 years, now it's 6 years. So we know for sure that Putin's going to be president for the next 6 years. He could be president for the next 12 years, which would put his presidency through 2024, which is wild for us, and you can imagine how it makes the protesters that want him out now feel. So what we can expect in the short run is probably you're going to see a lot more unrest in the Moscow and St. Petersburg areas, some of the more richer and more politically aware areas. So we're starting to see the desire and the emphasis kind of whittle away from those protests as people start to feel a little more hopeless that there's anything that can be done even with their protest. But they still should persist a little bit, at least in the short run. And so the interesting thing to see for Russia is how Putin's going to handle them. So on one hand, he could listen to their demands, make a reasonable effort to appease them, and kind of reach out to the protesters. That's one thing he could do. Or he could crack down on the opposition, so he could start busting up these rallies, throwing opposition leaders in jail, and that's another route he can go. So we'll see which way he ends up going. For the region, you shouldn't really expect many changes. So it kind of goes without saying that this election was never really in any doubt. So Putin supposedly got 65% of the vote, if you believe the official authorities, which you probably shouldn't. But even if you take the fraud out, he probably got legitimately more than 50% of the vote. So on one hand, there was never any kind of question of whether or not Putin will return to presidency. And as far as the regions of the former Soviet Union on the borders of Russia go, there's little, if any, difference in the positions of foreign policy between outgoing President Medvedev and incoming President Putin. So you shouldn't expect many differences there. With regard to the U.S., U.S.-Russian relations are not at a very good point right now. So when President Obama came into office, he made a very high-profile effort to, quote, reset relations with Russia. So we're going to forget about all our attention to the past and work together on the areas that we have common interest in. And we've seen a little bit of that, particularly in Iran. There's been some good cooperation there, but there's still so many contentious issues between the United States and Russia. So NATO enlargement is one. So the United States wants to work in Ukraine and Georgia, other countries like that, who, by the way, also want to join NATO. But Russia is obviously vehemently opposed to that. They certainly don't want NATO operations going on their borders, understandably so, probably. Missile defense is another contentious issue. So the United States wants to build some kind of missile defense system in Eastern Europe. Poland is one place that's been thrown out there as a means of protecting ourselves against missiles from rogue states or Iran, for example. So we view that as a national security thing to protect both us and our allies in Europe. Russia views it as a big missile system that's put on their outside borders, and so they're obviously not very happy with that. As well. And just one last issue, the Arab Spring. So the United States and Russia see the democratization movements in the Middle East in very, very different lights. So we see it as a push for human rights and democracy and the empowerment of the people. Russia sees it as just threats to authoritarian leaders that looks a lot like what might happen if there was some kind of uprisal in Russia. So we see that in a very different light, and that's starting to be an issue of major contentions between us. I mentioned the Arab Spring, just with regard to Syria, probably more blocking of action. So Russia famously joined up with China to block any kind of UN action in regards to Syria, and we can expect them to continue to stay pretty steadfast on that. And just lastly, with regard to Europe, Europe and Russia have talked about closer economic integration for a long time. Europe is obviously very dependent on Russian energy, but I just don't see much hope for better cooperation between the two. So corruption in Russia is rampant. The rule of law when it comes to property rights, contract enforcement is very, very at unacceptable levels, to be quite frank. And so it's not a big surprise that Europeans don't want to invest their money there, and European businesses don't want to expand to do business there. So I don't see a whole lot of progress on that front, despite the rhetoric between the two sides.
But Nick, just to go back a bit, why did Vladimir Putin's election bid or subsequently his re-election receive so much pushback, especially from the youth of Russia?
Well, that's an important point, but first you have to remember that there's been two elections recently in Russia. So we've had the election at the beginning of March, which was the presidential election that Vladimir Putin won, and then we have the parliamentary elections that took place back in December. And there was much more unrest and outrage during the parliamentary elections than there were during Putin's elections. And so there's a few different reasons for that. One is that Putin as an individual is much more popular than the party that he associates himself with, which is called United Russia. And so people are a lot more willing to support him, while they might want to move a little away from his party. Another reason is there was a lot less outright fraud in this election. So during the parliamentary elections, people would bring video cameras to polling booths and catch ballot stuffing actually taking place in action. And they definitely toned it down, the Putin regime, for this election, probably because they knew with the outrage in the previous election, there would be much more international attention. So they didn't want to look quite as bad as they had back in the parliamentary elections. And the second reason why you didn't see quite as much or the last reason you haven't seen quite as much outrest this time, is that there just weren't very many good opposition candidates, so Putin kind of won by default. So there's lots of ways to rig an election besides just stuffing ballots. And one way is to make sure everyone else who's going to be on the ballot is even more unattractive than you are. So if you look at the presidential candidates in this recent election, besides Putin, 3 of them were candidates who always run for president and always lose, so 3 losers. And then Mikhail Prokhorov, who people in the West know as the owner of the New Jersey Nets, people in Russia know as an oligarch who made his billions while most Russians were losing their life savings. So that's not exactly someone that they can relate to. But you mentioned the youth being especially outraged, and that's a good point. And there's a few reasons why the youth are a little more upset and a little more anti-Putin than the population as a whole. One is the rise of alternative media, especially the internet. So older Russians generally get their news from state television, which is controlled by the government. So if all you're watching is news programs on the Russian state television networks, you're getting a bunch of coverage that's very favorable towards the policies of Putin and Medvedev, and covers little, if any, of the opposition movement. So you're not going to simply be exposed to any other alternative points of view. However, if you're a younger student who's living in Moscow and has internet access, for example, you have unlimited access to media, and so you can go on and read about what's really happening. You can read about some of the corruption going on in the Putin administration. You can read about the massive uprisings that are taking place around Russia, and so that's going to make you a little more inclined to get away from the Putin regime. And the last thing that I think is a really good point is one thing I think is often misconstrued in the West is that we in the United States think that universally people of the world view democracy as this great thing, and free speech and freedom of the press as these great things. But it's not so in Russia. So if you ask an older Russian, what do they most commonly associate with democracy, they'll say the 1990s, so the period after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was characterized by the fall of communism, removal of price controls, which led to massive inflation and people's life savings being completely eroded, their country almost collapsing. The patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church called the 1990s the worst time in Russia's history since the Napoleonic invasion. So that gives you a sense of what they think of that. And lastly, and probably most importantly, a president in Boris Yeltsin who was an unaffected drunkard, basically, who went around the world stage completely embarrassing Russia. So this is what older Russians think of when they think of democracy. And the reason why the youth are a little bit more open to it and favorable to the idea of a more democratic government is because they simply weren't around for those times, and they were so young that they don't remember. And so the youth, because they don't have this past aversion to democracy, are more open to thinking that some kind of reforms need to happen. And just kind of a final note, economy plays a major role in how people feel about their administration. And when Putin took over, oil prices were riding high, and that allowed people's incomes to go up, standard of living to go up as well. And if you're getting richer and your life's getting better, you're a lot more willing to look the other way when it comes to, anti-democratic crackdowns and suppression of free speech and things like that. And so now that the Russian economy is starting to have a bit of a recession due to the global financial crisis, people are saying, well, look, our incomes aren't going up anymore, so we're going to pay a little more attention to the other injustices that we're seeing going on.
So, Vladimir Putin also made some comments about the West meddling during the elections. Did he have any basis for this, or did he just decide to blame somebody for what was actually happening in the country, or what is your take on this?
So for those of us who follow Russia closely, this is classic Putin. So whenever anybody makes any kind of critique of his regime or his government, he always says, "Oh, those aren't real Russians that have complaints about my regime. They're just people who are being paid off by the West, and that's the only reason they're saying anything." So it's his classic way of delegitimizing any kind of criticism of his government. And this is especially rich. So if you look at the recent protests, so the ones in December where 100,000 people were coming out in below 0-degree weather to demand for an end to Putin's rule. One of the things that United Russia, the political party that supports Putin, wanted to do to try to counteract this was have their own rally. So they would get right next to the protesters of Putin with people who were supposedly supporting Putin. And so we actually were able to kind of interview some of the people who went to these pro-Putin rallies, and it turns out that they were actually being paid to be there and being bussed in. So he wants to delegitimize these protesters, but if any of them are fake and kind of just there for the money, it's the ones that are there supporting Putin. And the second reason why I think Putin is making a little more critical comments of the West lately is that I think he's getting more and more irritated with us regarding our policies to the Arab Spring. So if you look at Libya, for example, Russia thought that they were doing us a favor by not vetoing authorization of action in Libya within the United Nations. So they decided just to abstain, they wouldn't veto. And they felt like we took advantage of them when we actually, as soon as we got authorization, we moved in with other countries' help. And it was mostly done by the Libyans themselves. But we did everything in our power to actually get Gaddafi out of power. And so Russia was really angered by that. And you can see, if you're trying to understand what they're doing in Syria right now, which is basically propping up a leader who's massacring his people in places like Homs, you have to see how Putin views these things. So he doesn't view them, as I said earlier, as a democratization movement to empower the people. He sees that as just a massive opposition movement that could very really take place in Russia. So he thinks that one of the reasons why the U.S. is supporting these opposition movements is that we, as Americans, want to see a big protest movement in Russia that will rise, just like populations in the Middle East have risen and demand an ouster of President Putin. And so that's why he's very skeptical of that there, and he's made it very clear that he is not on board with us and how we're handling the Arab Spring. And just lastly, we're not completely scotch-free either. The view of Russia, and particularly Putin in the West right now, is extremely negative. And this is going to be tough going forward to negotiate with Putin when so much of the American population thinks that he's someone that we maybe shouldn't be doing business with. And so I was reading Foreign Policy this morning, and Mitt Romney had penned an article that was scolding Barack Obama for even congratulating Putin on his re-election. So, so a combination of wanting to deflect criticism of his regime, complications we've had in the Middle East, and rhetoric that he's hearing on our end is why I think he's been especially going after us lately.
So what should we expect from Putin in the coming years? What would Russia be like under Putin after his re-election?
We can break it down into two sides, so political and economical. Is an economical a word? Political and economically. So the basic answer is it's too early to know, right? So we know that Putin is going to be in power for 6 more years. We also know that if he doesn't want to make any changes, he probably doesn't have to. So the legislature in Russia is very pro-Putin. He could ignore protesters and not have to worry about getting any pressure, like the United States president has to worry about the Congress approving his plans. But regarding reform, if Putin did want to make some changes, there's a few things that he's alluded to. So one of them is bringing back the election of regional governors. So right now, all of the regional governors in Russia are appointed by the central government. And so that would be the equivalent of something like the president of the United States appointing all the governors of America. So it seems like an absurd and very undemocratic thing. And so he's talked about doing away with that and actually starting to have more elections there. But to see major reform in Russia, we're going to have to see some kind of constitutional reform. So another misconception in the West, I think, is that we think that all constitutions are invested in the people, giving limited power to a federal government. But it's a lot different in Russia. So a lot of the authoritarian characteristics you see of the Putin regime are actually made possible by the Constitution. And so they actually allow for a very, very strong president, very limited checks on his power, et cetera. And so if we're going to see some change, it's got to be with changes to the Constitution. And so outgoing President Medvedev has actually talked about holding a constitutional convention to look at some of these issues. And so again, it's too early to tell, are they going to take that convention seriously and try to actually make some changes, or is it just a show to try to appease people without actually doing anything? And just a few more words on the protest movement. So if you look at just the makeup of them, you see 100,000 people completely packing a square, and your first impression is, wow, that's so many people. They're really going to be able to demand some real changes. But the protesters have really one thing in common, and that's an opposition to Putin. And besides that, they're hopelessly fragmented. So if you look at the makeup of these groups, you have ardent communists, you have genuine liberals, and you have far-right nationalists. And so people that would disagree on virtually every issue besides that they don't like Putin, basically. And so Putin is using this to his advantage. So he says, look, I'm happy to negotiate with protest movements and opposition movements, but there's not a real opposition movement with stated goals. There's just these bunch of random people who are not making any kind of specific demands, which is, I have to say, a pretty fair criticism right now. So there's a few standout people. One is a young lawyer named Alexei Navalny. He kind of got famous for exposing a lot of corruption in Russian government contracts. And so he's got a little bit of support, but there's going to have to be a lot more centralization of the protest movement if they're going to be able to actually put some serious pressure on the Putin regime. And just a few comments on the economic side. The most exciting thing going on in Russia economically is that they're finally going to be a member of the World Trade Organization. So that might not seem like a very exciting thing considering well over 100 countries are already a member, but Russia has been trying to get in since 1993, and before their accession they were the largest economy outside of the WTO. And so the World Bank estimates that this will raise Russia's GDP annually or to an annual level of something like 10% in the long run and 3% in the short run. So it's going to be things like eliminating some of the tariffs, liberalizing their services sector, et cetera. But that being said, the Russian business climate is really, really poor. So I have my numbers here. They're actually ranked 120th out of 183 countries, and that puts them right between Pakistan and Central African Republic on places of ease of doing business. So as I kind of alluded to earlier, corruption is rampant in Russia. So many bribes have to be paid to be able to start a business. Tax policy is inconsistent. Rule of law and expropriation are major issues as well. And unless Russia takes serious efforts to reform these and make some genuine improvements, they can expect to continue to stay out and not get a lot of investment in their country. And just a few comments on energy prices. Russia's economy is still completely dependent on world energy prices. So one of the things I was naively hopeful about when Medvedev took power is that he constantly said, I'm going to diversify Russia's economy, and this would be a great thing to do, but unfortunately there haven't been any kind of steps taken on this front. And so when oil prices are high like they are now, it's great for Russia. They're collecting tons of tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. But when energy prices are low, they're in real big trouble. And the problem with that is that they have no control over world energy prices, so they're basically putting themselves at the whim of the rest of the world. And this is especially troubling because one of the ways Putin tried to raise support from the middle class during his election is he made promises of a lot more government spending. So he said that he was going to raise salaries for doctors and policemen and teachers, and he was going to raise pensions. And even push ahead with this program. It's called a baby bonus. So they pay women to have kids, something like $8,000 up to 3 kids, which is due to the fact that Russia's growth rate is 0% right now, which is obviously not sustainable in the long run. But all those things are going to be really expensive. And I was reading a report by Citigroup that said for Russia to be able to afford all of these new programs and not push their budget into deficit, they need oil prices to be at about $150 a barrel, which they've never been before. So they're on a really, really bad track economically. They can get away from that somehow if they start to make some reforms to their economy. But as I said, I've been hoping for that to happen for several years, and there have been no positive signs. So it's hard to be really optimistic about the Russian economy.
Well, Nick, we'd like to thank you for coming on to the show, and we hope to see you here again. Talk more about Russia. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome.